Hello, co-journeyers, and welcome back to the Truth So Help Me Good. I am your host, Barbara Landry, and together we continue to explore some of those bigger questions about this journey we call life. Today, my special guest is author Wendy B. Correa. Wendy is a writer, a hiker, as well as a licensed massage therapist. She has worked in the film, television, multimedia, and music industries in Los Angeles and is a radio DJ in Aspen, Colorado. Wendy holds bachelor's degrees in psychology and theater arts and has contributed articles to Mothering Magazine. She is a wife and a mother and resides in Denver, Colorado. Today, she is here to speak to us about her new memoir, My Pretty Baby. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It is fabulous to be here with you today.
I'm so excited to have you here because your book is amazing. Um, it's a incredible journey full of vulnerability, transparency, wisdom, and some hard details of your journey that so let me get right to it then. What inspired you to write your story? Why did you feel it was important? And what did you hope to achieve by writing it?
Well, the stories and the experiences of my life, of my childhood, just kept bubbling up. And I would say they were sitting on my shoulder, just badgering me. They needed to be told. And as I wrote My Pretty Baby, I realized that um, I was doing an autopsy of my family. And as I wrote, I was peeling apart the layers of generational trauma and my childhood trauma and family dysfunction, the family secrets and addiction. And I found healing through my Buddhist practice and meditation, yoga, sobriety, music, psychotherapy, and Native American spirituality. And so as I was writing it, I realized this isn't just my memoir. This is a call to action. This is a guidebook for other people who may be just beginning their healing journeys. And it's a call to action because we need to be able to speak about mental health issues and childhood trauma without shame and to be able to speak openly and honestly so that we can heal as a culture. Because all you have to do is look around at our society to see that we need tremendous healing. And I feel like by having these open, honest conversations about the intergenerational trauma that has been handed down to us and so on, that's the way that we're going to heal. So it was, I, you know, I just had these urgent nudges that I have to write about this. And it wasn't until my son, I have one son, and I spent, I just wanted to focus on raising my son for many years. And when he was old enough when he was in high school, is when I started to write some of the chapters. And then it was when, after my mother had passed and when my stepfather died in 2019, is when I finally wrote the full first draft and have done many drafts since then. But you know, what I hope my readers will take away first and foremost, I would like to talk more about adverse childhood experiences, and I want this to be a platform for talking about adverse childhood experiences and how 64% of adults have experienced at least one of the 10 that they point out in a quiz that you can take online. And So I want people to, by me telling my story, I hope that other people feel less alone in their story. And I want people to realize that while trauma is universal, so is healing.
Mm,
And that telling the truth about what happened isn't about blame or retribution. It's about breaking cycles and healing. And especially if you have children, I feel that the greatest gift that you can give your children is to be the cycle breaker yourself and to know that healing isn't just possible, it's contagious in the best sense of the word.
Okay, let me stop you there for a second and just back up a little bit because um, referencing being a cycle breaker, and you mentioned generational trauma as well as our individual trauma. Um, let's dig into that a little bit because I think this is something that is, in my experience, at least my exposure to it, is relatively new, this concept of generational trauma and how our individual trauma is affected by that. So, what exactly does that mean? When you use that term generational trauma, what is it and how does it apply to our own individual healing from our own trauma? What is the relationship there?
Well, there's so many stories, and generational trauma is just the trauma that perhaps your parents or grandparents experienced that was never healed, that was never talked about, that was pushed under the rug, that was, something we just don't talk about. And you'll find this, especially a lot of immigrant families. My stepfather, for instance, his family came from Switzerland a couple of generations ago. And after his death, I uncovered the intergenerational trauma that his family went through because they left Switzerland at a time when Switzerland was really struggling and people were very poor. So they came to the US seeking, a new life, which is the whole immigrant story. We're going to find a new life in the land of, milk and honey. But these immigrants make sometimes very difficult decisions, and they come to this country with, a nickel in their pockets, and there's a lot of prejudice towards newcomers and people who don't speak the language, and all of those things that immigrants um, are encountered with. In my father's family, particularly, they they the husband, I believe, is the one who made an excruciating decision to leave their infant daughter in Switzerland and to only bring the two older boys. And so I can only imagine, well, first of all, women didn't even have the right to vote in Switzerland until 1974. So I'm assuming that the mother did not make that decision to
Mm,
leave her baby daughter in Switzerland. And so I can only imagine the grief and the resentment and the anger that was in that household um, from leaving their child in Switzerland and how that trickled down to my stepdad, who was beaten severely by his father and kicked out of the house at 12. You'll find the same thing in all kinds of immigrant families. And, even in Jewish families, the horrors of the Holocaust that have trickled down into subsequent generations and the things that we can't talk about. And in the case of my mother, for instance, she had a horrific secret that she had been sexually assaulted as a child by a neighbor. And that was a secret that she carried until her late 70s. And so that that secret affected her whole life. It affected a lot of her choices. And so that's what I'm talking about, that generational trauma that parents pass on to their children. And it keeps getting passed on until you say, like I did, the trauma ends with me.
right,
I'm the cycle breaker,
right.
and I'm going to absorb the pain of my entire lineage. I am going to absorb this pain and process this pain and work on healing this pain and do everything that I need to do to not pass this on to my son.
Right, right, right. And so um, it feels like the right moment to bring up Thich Nhat Hanh, who is somebody, a wonderful Buddhist teacher who you reference often in your book. And can you share the quote about what he says about happiness?
Yes, and Thich Nhat Hanh's books, and I luckily before he passed, I had the opportunity to sit with him
Mm,
in meditation a few times when he came to Colorado. And during my darkest hours of dealing with some of the more recent revelations about my family, it was his books that really helped me through a very dark time. And because when we talk about um, in Buddhist psychology, the need to acknowledge and recognize and sit with the pain, that if we deny our pain, we're just denying our healing. And so Buddhist psychology talks a lot about we're using meditation, we're using mindfulness, we're using loving kindness as a way to sit with and feel that pain instead of, for instance, drinking or doing drugs or gambling or shopping or any other thing that we might do to try to cover up the pain. And so the beloved Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh said that the art of happiness is also the art of suffering well.
mhm,
So that's the answer to how to be happy. Well, because we need to acknowledge and allow whatever feelings come up. A lot of them are just fleeting. Some of them may be fully ingrained in us from old, tapes from our childhood or our culture or our families. But those thoughts that come up, they're just thoughts. They're just mind matter, as Joseph Goldstein says. They're just thoughts are not true. So don't believe everything that you think is another
mhm,
wonderful thing. Um, so, but we need to embrace the pain. We need to feel it so that we can process it. And even the great poet Robert Frost said, the only way out is through.
mhm,
And I also talk about or list in the back of my book for references. Whitney Goldman wrote a book called Toxic Positivity. And so she writes a lot about how people in our culture, everybody wants to look perfect. There's the perfect Instagram photos, and everybody wants to present that they're all great and everything is perfect and they have the perfect life and the perfect job and everything is perfect and no one wants to talk about difficult subjects. And that also comes from generations of the immigrants who they couldn't spend the time to talk about the difficult things. They were just busy trying to survive and put one foot in front of the other. And even my mother, bless her heart, who told me, at one time said to me, Wendy, we didn't have Oprah when I was coming up.
mhm.
And, really, Oprah did open up the door to a lot of our being able to discuss these topics openly and honestly without that shame. But um, real resilience comes from facing our pain and not papering over it with a smile.
Right. Which leads me to wanting to talk a little bit about young Wendy, because one of the things that really struck me in reading your book and reading about your childhood and the things you were going through, your father died when you were very young, so you immediately had a very significant grief experience and then some very challenging experiences after that with a stepfather. But what was really remarkable to me is your ability to feel compassion and empathy for the people around you, even though you yourself was suffering. Um, and that a resilience that you developed, or either that was innate at a very young age. Can you talk about that? What was it in you that allowed you to sort of rise above your circumstances in terms of your own perceptions?
That is a great question, and I think it is, I think it's an important question for all of us to consider in our society because is it nature? Is it nurture? Was I born empathetic and compassionate and just, you know, a highly sensitive person, an empath, they're sometimes called, where I feel everything and I can sort of see people's pain in a way, but there's a couple of things that may have contributed to it. I think it's well documented now, researchers who have studied parent loss, and it's well documented that children who experience parent loss, especially under the age of 12, are immensely impacted, of course, negatively, but they also tend to develop characteristics such as empathy, and they have a heightened sense of perception. Um, they also just have this awareness and an empathy towards others because people who have suffered, I think, do develop empathy. If someone's life is just golden and they've never had a challenge, then it's maybe hard for them to have empathy for someone who is having challenges. But particularly children under the age of 12 who experience a parent loss tend to develop these kinds of characteristics of empathy. But the other thing is, quickly after my father died, then I was subjected to my alcoholic and violent stepfather for many years, and that flooded my system with the fight or flight hormones. So I was in a constant state of fight or flight. And then in that state, you learn to really read the room. You kind of, are like the deer in the woods, when you hear a gunshot, you're in a constant state of readiness. And I think that also contributed to, um, you know, others' plights in the
Mhm.
world. You know, it took me a long time actually to, really look at myself and have compassion for what I went through because I was always comparing, like, well, you're still fed and clothed, you don't have it as bad as children in a third world country, who are so I was, always comparing my my pain until I read Man's Search for Meaning, and more recently, oh, she'll come to me. That it's not helpful to try to compare traumas or say that yours is less than. Um, Mr. Frankel, said suffering is suffering. And there is no, my suffering is worse than yours. But I think some of the experiences, like even traveling with my parents, um, to like South Dakota, to the reservation there when I was a young child and was able to see the poverty on the reservations and the alcoholism. And it made me want to do something about that. And also I always wanted to help other kids who might have been in a home life like mine.
Mm.
So it just, I wanted to do something. And so I don't know, a friend recently asked, like, what was it about you that had this strong sense of survival? Whereas another person, I could have easily fallen into, if I hadn't gotten sober, for instance, I could have easily died of an overdose or, you know, drunk driving. I could have easily succumbed to something like that, but I did have a very strong sense of survival from a very young age. And even at 9 years old, the first violent attack in my home with my stepfather, there was a voice inside of me that was able to say, this is really his problem. Um, although children do internalize this, which I also did. So there was kind of both. There was a voice saying, this is not your fault, but another voice, because I wasn't developmentally mature enough to understand, children will internalize it and say, this must somehow be my
Right.
fault.
And possibly responsibility. And I wanted to ask you about that. So I also want to just mention that at the same time as you're experiencing within your own family this trauma and loss, um, John Kennedy is assassinated, then Robert Kennedy is assassinated, Martin Luther King. So there's all this trauma going on within our own country, within our own society. And so I wanted to ask you, you became very involved in activism. And isn't it tricky based on everything you just said in terms of wanting to make a difference and being strong and being resilient and having empathy and wanting to help and feeling that we're responsible, that somehow it is incumbent upon us to help because somehow we are responsible for this and not in a healthy way, in a way of having been victims of trauma ourselves. Do you understand what I'm asking you? And how do we know the difference? Or does it matter? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I I really don't think that I finally fully grasped until you get to the end of my book. And actually, that's part of the journey. I really took me decades to, really grasp what happened to my family. And as I uncovered family secrets and, went to therapy, but there was still a driving force in me that wanted to contribute something somehow, even as I was trying to heal myself and, to get sober when I was in the music industry in LA. And when I was seeking, I was always seeking, by studying Buddhism and going to Est and Siddha Yoga and, studying with Miraji and becoming a Primi and all the things that I did and kept doing and the years of Native American spirituality, I was still healing myself and but still, a driving factor was wanting to be part of the solution, I guess. I did have that driving sense that I wanted to do something. And I guess I would say my pretty baby, my book, and spelling it out is sort of what I'm now contributing.
Yes,
That's the ultimate thing that I'm contributing is my own story, as I said before, so that others feel less alone in their stories, but also because you and I are here today having this conversation,
yes,
and that's exactly what I hope my pretty baby gets the ball rolling on is that
absolutely.
conversation. But no, I think, that it's important to follow your heart and, even while you're aware that you're not completely healed, because I don't necessarily think we ever will be. So it's life in process.
Yes, yes, yes. And just so you know, I am so grateful that we are here having this conversation. So thank you so much for writing the book and doing all the work. Um, so one of the fun things about your book is all the encounters you had with some very, very interesting people, some pop culture icons. Tell us about some of that because it's really fun and interesting.
So I guess you're talking about Joni.
Of course. So jealous. What, Jody?
Um, and yeah, I mean, the reason that I talk about that is because, of course, Joni Mitchell is an icon. She's one of the most important singer-songwriters of our generation, and she is such an icon that that experience that I had with Joni really affected me and really boosted me and healed me in a way. This woman who was a total stranger. I was not a famous person. I wasn't a musician. I was like, you know, a girl from Illinois, and the fact that she reflected to me my self-worth and my value, and she was interested in me. She
Mhm.
wanted to hear what I was up to in life, and I was just, what? And her just loving nature. So just backing up for a second, I had a friend, Boyd Elder, who was a fabulous and famous artist, and you would know Boyd by his album covers that he did, and probably the one that is most famous is of the Eagles, the skull
Oh, yeah,
on
yeah.
the cover of the Eagles. So Boyd was a friend, and he he would take me, he knew a lot of famous people, and he would take me to meet different people, and that was always fabulous. So one day he showed up at a restaurant that I was working at in Malibu, and I was like, "Hey Boyd, what are you doing? Are you here to get something to eat?" And he's like, "No, I want to take you to meet a friend of mine." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Even though I just worked, a busy shift, and I had barbecue sauce all over my shirt, and I, was sweaty and a mess, and we go driving up Pacific Coast Highway towards Malibu, and it wasn't until we pulled into the exclusive Malibu colony that I was like, wait, what? Where are we? Where are we going? And who am I meeting? And he says, "Oh, she doesn't care what you look like. Who is she, Boyd? Who is she?" As he's ringing the bell, and there is Joni Mitchell. And I, just was speechless, but she was so warm and shook my hand, invited me into the house, and they were talking about Bobby this and Bobby that, and I had no idea what they were talking about until it dawned on me that Bobby was Bob Dylan. And so Boyd went to go call Bobby, and Joni took me through her house to show me her beautiful art collection of her own paintings, but also her Native American collection. And there was this gorgeous beaded cradle board. And then, she asked me if I knew anything about the I Ching, which was very popular at the time, and I knew a lot about the I Ching. And we sat on her floor throwing the I Ching
Wow.
coins and smoking cigarettes and laughing, and I mean, I was out of my body with what is happening
Yeah.
here. And I got to spend time with her on numerous occasions, um, with Boyd. And the point of writing that story the first time that I met her is because at the time I was really struggling with not feeling loved and in my own family. And the point was, if Joni Mitchell cares about me and treats me and sees value in me, well, then expletive the rest of my family who seems to not really care about me. And, you know, that And then I also talk about a similar story with Hunter S. Thompson, who I later became an assistant to. And the point being is you just never know what your kindness, your simple kindness to a stranger, excuse me, might help that person in a time that they really need that kindness.
Mm.
And that just, for me, illustrates it in a fantastical way because it was Joni Mitchell.
Right? Wow, that's amazing. So, as part of your healing journey, you talk about forgiveness, which is a very challenging thing for a lot of people. And I think often misunderstood in terms of what it is and what it isn't. Can you talk a little bit about that, your experience with forgiveness? And
Yes, and I would read to you just a tad of what I wrote
oh, I'd
because
love that.
the forgiveness piece can be very, very difficult for people. And what I found through the writer and Buddhist psychologist Jack Kornfield finally made sense to me. As Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist Jack Kornfield explains, forgiveness is fundamentally for our own sake, for our own mental health. It is a way to let go of the pain we carry. According to Buddhist psychology, forgiveness is a way to end suffering and to bring dignity and harmony to our life. We must also forgive ourselves for any role we may have knowingly or unknowingly played by staying too long in an abusive relationship or waiting for an apology that will never come, for example, and acknowledging that we may have hurt and betrayed others just as we have been harmed by them. I still believe that everyone has the right to forgive on their own terms and time, or not to forgive at all. Some things may, in fact, be unforgivable, but if you are able to forgive, you will give yourself the gift of peace and freedom. Forgiveness does not condone the actions of others, nor do we have to forget what occurred in order to forgive. Forgiveness does not necessarily mean reconciliation either. As a wise person once said, I may forgive them, but that doesn't mean I want to have lunch with them.
Right, right. Right. It's a way of ending our own suffering because when we are angry, when we harbor those awful feelings of resentment and all that negativity, it's within us. So
Exactly. We're
forgiveness
the
is
ones feeling that.
right.
We're the ones suffering.
And there's,
And
yeah, go ahead.
I realized too, I didn't deserve to suffer anymore.
Right,
So I
exactly.
was able to forgive, but as I say, some things may not be forgivable, especially for me. I feel that any kind of abuse of a child um, is not forgivable. And so we should not as a culture also say, oh, but they're your family. You should forgive them. And, oh, but, family is so important. And um, it does not. It does not. Eamon Dolan just recently wrote a book called The Power of Parting. And I love that he said we should hold our family to the same standards as friends. I mean, if we have a friendship with someone that turns sour or is negative or toxic and they're abusive towards you, you just end that friendship and move on. But when it's a family member that we feel we need to have boundaries with, we call it estrangement.
Right.
But, I'm, as you read in my book, family is not necessarily, blood is not necessarily thicker than water, especially
Yes.
if it's an abusive um, situation.
Yes. Yes.
And sometimes Healing means stronger boundaries. I mean, maybe you don't have to completely be estranged from someone, but perhaps you need just those stronger boundaries.
Right. And it does, for me, include the idea of the generational trauma in terms of, everybody has their own set of circumstances that they bring to the table. And so it's very complicated. And just like grief, just like trauma, just like suffering, they're all universal, but they're also very unique and individual to this specific person and situation.
Yes,
So, yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So, um, I think you may have touched upon this earlier, but just to bring it back around as we get ready to close here, what is your greatest wish, hope, desire for your readers in terms of what they will take away from your book?
So again, I realized as I was writing it that it wasn't just my memoir. It is a memoir for everyone. And while I was writing the book, I also researched many of the most current books on adverse childhood experiences and saw myself on every page and realized and learned statistically 64% of adults have at least one adverse childhood experience. And readers can Google adverse childhood experiences quiz. There's only 10 questions. And so I have a score of 7 out of 10.
Wow.
Um, at least 64% of people have at least one of those. And the the understanding is that the trauma that you carry from childhood can increase your risk for addiction
Yes.
and mental illness and diseases, and that trauma is a public health issue that we need to address. So if 64% of adults have at least one ACE or adverse childhood experience, even if you had the most perfect childhood, that, your neighbor, your boss, your friend, your spouse, somebody you know has been affected by the ACEs. And so this isn't just my story, it's everyone's. And so writing the book, I realized this is a call to action for us to have these conversations. This is also meant as a guidebook so that people will follow me along on my, multi-decade journey of healing and know that, it may take a village of trying different things. I mean, I did meditation and yoga and Buddhism and all of the modalities that I use, and they were all important to me. Someone recently interviewed me and asked if any of those were detours, and I was like, no, none of them were. They were all important steps in my path. And so I also want to reiterate that although trauma is universal, so is healing. And so I hope that my pretty baby gives people hope to find the way to their journey, the way for them to find healing. And that's my greatest desire is that if my pretty baby helps one person feel less alone, then my heart is full.
Mm, that's so beautiful. And it feels like an invitation for all of us who have had any adverse childhood experience. That's the ACE you were talking about,
Yes,
to have it end with us, to have
yes.
it end with us. And
And to be
so,
the cycle breaker, even
yes,
it may not be easy, but it is worth it.
yes,
Your
yes.
life is worth it.
Oh, and the lives of our children, right?
Yes,
So here it is, my pretty baby. And what's the best way to get our hands on this book,
Well,
Wendy?
you can buy this book wherever books are sold, wherever you like to buy books, whether it's your independent bookstore or on Bookshop or Amazon or Simon and Schuster, Barnes and Noble, all the places.
Okay.
And I also recorded my own audiobook. So the paperback is available, the Kindle is available, and the audiobook that I
Fabulous.
narrated myself is available for those of you that love to listen to
Awesome.
audiobooks. It's all available. And crazily enough, it hit number one Amazon bestseller when the book first came out. The book, the Kindle, and the audiobook. And the Kindle is still holding on to number one bestseller on Amazon in the alcoholism category. So
Congratulations.
it's
That's
obviously
huge,
hitting a chord with people, and for that I'm very grateful.
as am I. Thank you so much. What a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for getting my pretty baby out into the world and into the hands of everyone who should
My
read it.
pleasure.
Thank
It's where
you.
it belongs. Thank you,
Thank
Wendy.
you.